That's
continue
why I'm
with
here.
this issue about
Okay,
corporations.
excuse me.
We all have issues with corporations.
I'll go,
so I want to
check
get
my
into
email.
conversation with Caleb Maupin, who's going to join us via Skype or Skype/phone/
kinda hot in here.
virtually through the electromagnetic fields.
EMF.
The magic of the interwebs.
Caleb is cool. He does work with RT as I do, and he's a commentator. He's written some books. He's considered, I guess he'd call himself socialist, and that's why I want to have this discussion, because I think there's at this point, I've seen him debate a fascist, right? I've literally seen what they call him alt-right, right? Like an alt-right guy and a socialist debating. And what I loved was the fact that they agreed on so much, which is fundamentally, we all hate the corporate state.
Yeah.
We're all tired of the corporate takeover of America.
How are you?
I love it.
Caleb,
Hey.
can you hear us?
Hey.
Hey, can you hear us or hey?
I can hear you. Yes. I'm wondering if I should put my phone on speaker. That way you can still hear me, and then hear you over the computer. And I'll mute my phone. Does that sound good?
You can't hear us on the phone?
I can hear you on the phone, but should I just be holding my phone as I talk? Or?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
you can put it on speaker. That's cool.
Okay.
If you can hear us, press the number 2.
How's that?
All right.
Okay. Still coming in clear. So
Por español.
Very good. Very good.
two for
Habla
Spanish.
español.
So I was just introducing you a little bit, Caleb, talking about how you are a writer, and you've done. This is a new book that you have out. I think it's called The City Builders. Is that it?
City builders and vandals in our age.
Awesome. You see,
here.
I think we can all agree on that.
Oh, what was that?
Right? The city builders and vandals in our age. But
that's a
Caleb,
good one.
as I understand it, is essentially looking at this ancient debate between left and right. Why don't you give us a little pitch on your book?
Okay. Well, I've gotten a lot of interesting feedback on it. When people saw that I was writing a book about socialism or whatnot, people expected that I was going to be writing the content of a Michael Moore movie or something. But when people,
Or a Bernie
when people took a
campaign
look at
speech.
it and they saw that I went back to Julius Caesar and I went back to the Epic of Gilgamesh and I talked about the struggle between human progress and chaos and reaction that has taken place throughout the centuries and millennium up to now. People thought it was a very, very unique approach, and it really transcends and tries to correct a lot of the confusion about the nature of the left and the right. I think a lot of people are stuck in a Cold War mentality, and this takes things up to now. And I get into all kinds of questions. I get into issues, for example, the negotiations on the Korean Peninsula, the nature of the Trump administration and the divisions within the billionaire monopolists that rule the United States, stuff like that.
I love you mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, because we were talking about The Fury of the Fist. The Fury of the Fist previously, which was the film we put out, and the Fist is inspired by Gilgamesh as the epic hero of beginning, really the first epic hero, I think, in Western literature, we could say.
Wow.
No?
Yeah.
I mean, you're an historian. So in terms of where we can agree, because this is really what I want to start with. I watched the Democratic debates, right? Out of actually, I was kind of forced.
You really
to. I was
hate
kind of
yourself,
forced to.
don't you?
No,
That was
and
under duress.
I'll tell you why. It was
really
under.
hate
It was semi under duress, but I'll tell you why.
Oh, it was
I
horrible.
wanted to see Marianne Williamson,
Oh,
and I'll tell
gosh.
you something.
You could just watch the 3 minutes they allow her to talk on
Exactly.
a highlight reel afterwards, and not have
Exactly.
to sit through all the other
Yeah.
bullshit.
No,
What an
I
insult.
get that, but here's my thing. I love Marianne Williamson as a candidate. I think that she's the only one out there that basically
yeah.
says, you guys are a bunch of frauds. I mean, she underhandedly said that to the rest of the Democratic Party, right? She goes, you guys are a bunch of frauds.
Yep.
And you're out here ultimately serving corporate interests,
Yep.
right?
Oh, look at him.
And it's really about we're not looking to the deeper issues, the underlying issues. We have to go with a state of love. And to me, this is
Oh, yeah.
the key moving forward. I think Adam agrees with that. Dean, I don't know if he knows what love is, but essentially we all are looking towards...
Wait,
Hey, don't make fun of his childhood, okay?
No.
Just 'cause he
What's
never
love
knew
got to do with it?
Oh, no, I would never do that. But the point is that
You're a
we're
terrible
moving
human
into a
being.
state of, it's about a future of basically, as Adam was talking about just before you came on, Caleb, localization, right? The idea that we as on a local or a more intimate level know each other better than at the grand state level. And so this is the issue that we always come to, right? Where it's like, how is it the one and the many can coincide? How can we as individual atoms in this, America, let's say, coexist when we're obviously so different, every one of us, and so many different interests, and yet they're trying to create one-size-fits-all modalities most of the time, right? It's like, well, the nature of democracy is 3 wolves vote and the one chicken gets eaten. It's unfair for most people because the wolves are being paid by corporations, even though the wolves are very small. The 1%, or let's say the elites, are a very small group. They have too much money and influence, as we know in politics, right? In the nature we talk about how we've seen the inflation of power into corporate hands. Everyone fundamentally is serving a corporation. We're buying from a Starbucks. We're going, we're eating at a corporate restaurant or a Walmart or whatever it is. We're trying to survive.
I love how you use yourself as the example there with your Starbucks in front of you.
I avoid it
There's
as
a
much
term
as
for that.
possible. But when you're
No,
traveling,
your point is it's pervasive. I mean, you can point to
pervasive.
the microphone, your T-shirt,
It's
the
pervasive.
stands, like
Yes.
everything.
It's
right.
pervasive, right? I mean, we're in this corporatocracy. And I think there is room now for the socialist and the anarchist or libertarian to come together and say there are certain principles that we're both working towards. How can we make them unite? All right. I gave my little spiel. Adam, what's your problem with Bernie? Let's start with that. And then Caleb can respond.
No, I'm gonna stay on the love train, Sean. No.
Somebody's high.
Yeah, no, I share your appreciation at a fundamental level for Marianne Williamson. I was asked of all the Democrat candidates which I would like to debate the most, and she was easily my top pick because I love that grounding, and I think it's been a big part of my own development in looking for a fundamental ethical principle that is based on love and respect and how I want to meet my fellow human beings and applying that to politics. And for a lot of time, since the founding of the Libertarian Party, libertarianism has been misrepresented as a political philosophy when it's really an ethical philosophy. And I think localization is the bridge. Mm-hmm. I really do. And I would love to hear Caleb's take on this because there are, and this is I know I feel in the company of such an expert, especially of the historical perspective, that this might be an insultingly simple oversimplification. But there are people who describe themselves as socialists, and that I see as kind of in one of two categories, at least. There are those who have no problem with state power, no problem with violence, no problem with the central authority, not just as a means to an end, but as the end state. They don't mind a sort of, I don't want to say totalitarian because they wouldn't say it that way, but they would admit that it's a coercive central authority. And then there are the socialists, and I think this is the majority, who say, no, the end goal has to be voluntary. And in a sense, they would be more anarcho-socialist. And if you're an anarcho-socialist, then you're on the same ethical page as me in the sense that I don't care what society looks like. I don't want to dictate to you what your community looks like, whatever you can come up with people coming together voluntarily. So I'll take a step back and turn over to Caleb with just one quick example. And although I'm a member of the tribe,
Which one?
The hook-nosed tribe.
Ashkenazi.
Yeah, right. Ashkenazi, actually, yes. And the fringe rise of white nationalism in the United States is genuinely viscerally disturbing to me. I just watched Woman in Gold, great movie about the painting, the Klimt repatriated from Austria. I have actually a family connection to that. My grandparents who left Hungary before World War II avoided that fate. But anyway, so as viscerally disturbing as that genuinely is, if you're a white nationalist or any other kind of ethno-statist and you think that people should congregate and form communities and societies based on race, I want you to have the right to do that. If you do it on private property, you go homestead your own space, you're not holding anybody captive, you're not forcing it on anybody else. As disgusting as I think that is, I will not use force to violate your right to come together peacefully, to organize that, to choose who you associate with and what those terms are, as long as it's voluntary. That's the criteria of ethics that's important to me. And on the flip side, you're a gun-grabbing socialist who wants to live in a commune in the woods where everybody's naked all the time. Like, hey, you know what? I'll keep I'm not going to live there, but I'll get my entertainment from a distance. That's great. But similarly, it's like, as long as you're not forcing it on anybody, you're not holding anybody captive there, I want you to have that right. And some people would say, and this is where I think the bridge to socialism is that, well, hey, let's establish this universal ethic. Mm-hmm. You just can't use force. You can't violate individual rights. You can't force yourself on anybody else or property that they've legitimately acquired, or however you want to define that. I know there's some argument there, and I admit that conversation is fundamentally subjective, but that if we say, this is the one ground rule, you can't violate individual rights, you can't use coercion, and the socialists would say, well, then some form of socialism is going to win. Okay, cool. As long as it happens voluntarily, people buy in. My right to opt out at any time is respected.
Sure.
Your right, everybody else's right to opt out at any time is respected. I'm all for it.
Caleb, any thoughts?
Well, I want to begin by saying that I admire Adam Kokesh in many ways. The fact that he's a veteran who speaks out against these ugly wars, I think that's very, very admirable. And on most day-to-day issues, we probably agree with each other. We see that the country is gradually turning into a low-wage police state. Our civil freedoms are being taken away. The big corporations and bankers have all the power. So on that point, we would agree. And I would even go further as to say we agree in the ultimate goal. I would like very much to get to a world that is free of coercion, a world where people can just kind of do what they feel like doing. But I think that the way to get there is that you have to get rid of scarcity and poverty, because that is the basis of state power and coercion throughout human history. Nobody was ever talking about human rights and civil freedoms until like the 1400s in Europe. And the reason for that was because Europe had reached a level of economic development that as we establish greater material abundance, we're able to open up as a society and have more freedom. And that the economic component behind politics and behind the basis of establishing more higher levels of individual rights can't really be ignored. And I think the only way that we can get to a society with so much material abundance that people can really have the level of total freedom that I think Adam strives for, and I think we all strive for, is if we get out of the system of production for profit. Banks, factories, and industries need to be operated in a rational way so that society can continue to have economic growth. We have a deeply irrational system. Capitalism, I define capitalism as a system where the major centers of economic power operate for profit. Capitalism is a deeply irrational system, and we're living in a time that is really defined by what I would call accumulation through destruction, where capitalists are essentially making profits not by making widgets or producing products, but rather through destroying things, right? Whether it's the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, the destruction of entire countries, sinking them into poverty and reducing them to captive markets. The way the billionaire globalist monopolists who run the United States acquire their wealth at this point is through holding back human progress. And I would say that what we need more than anything right now is we don't need to get the government out. We don't need chaos. We need a government of action that will take action and stand up to the billionaire banker elite that is destroying the future of this country and the planet. I think we need a government that will fight for average people. We need a government of action to fight for working families, and that would mean organizing the economy to serve public good rather than the irrationality of profits.
I wish I was taking notes. I wish I was taking notes to all that.
Let me respond to what he raised about the point about non-aggression and voluntarism. Because in essence, that sounds good. And like I said, I would like to get to a world without any coercion. But if you were to implement that at this moment, that would be kind of like, you almost have to imagine kids in a schoolyard, right? And they're playing that game King of the Mountain, right? They're trying to get to the top of the hill. And one kid gets to the top and he says, okay, new rule in the game, no pushing. Right? I mean, that's the operation here, because the way the people who rule the world at this point got their wealth was not through voluntary activities. It was through theft and coercion and all of that. So if we simply declare we change the rules of the game, all that does is solidify their position. I think that instead of having a government that fights for billionaires and monopolists, we need a government that fights for average working people, right? I think really, the Cold War is over, the 20th century is over, right? And the Soviet model of doing things is not going to return. Great things were accomplished, but also great problems and difficulties resulted from that. But the difference between 21st century socialism and capitalism is that in capitalism, the government is basically controlled by the corporations. The government is simply a front for billionaire monopolists. But 21st century socialism is when you have a state that is fighting and controlling the corporations. In capitalism, the corporations control the government. In socialism, In socialism, the government is controlling the corporations, and that's the difference. We need a government that controls the anarchy of production and allows unlimited economic growth. And I think the successes of China, the successes of what we did see in the Soviet Union, going from being one of the most impoverished countries in the world to going to be a global superpower, point to the fact that we can have a rationally planned economy outside of capitalism. We don't need the chaos of the market. We don't need the greed to be the basis of economic systems.
Well, this is where I'm actually getting to that path you're talking about. To me, there's a bridge. It's a really because it's an interesting conundrum, right? Like we're talking about places like China, which I would never want to live in. I mean, the censorship, the control is outrageous in the country, and it's unfair, really, in a sense of it's really a few people that have all the power. And yes, they've done wonderful things for bringing people out of poverty and building an infrastructure. But to me, the basis of what government should be about is basically providing infrastructure and helping infrastructure, and then getting out of the way of most businessmen. Because the biggest problem we've seen is, over the course of the 20th century is the consolidation. We talk about how corporations thrived. They thrived essentially because they gobbled up the small businesses and the middle-class businesses who largely, let's say, look, we know there's a Federal Reserve System that's fundamentally inflating the dollar, controlling our economy. The only way to actually, I think, arrive at this place you're talking about, Caleb, and you're talking about, Adam, is in a sense of us as individuals empowering ourselves through information to step out of those systems of power. So I think the path ultimately to move in that direction of where we want to go is not to say the government's going to be there and be the policeman for the corporations, because there's no way that you can get at this point, you can separate the self-interest of the corporations who are basically buying politics, and it's not going to, they're affecting politics. There's no way you're going to change that at this moment. But we as people, what we can do is educate ourselves to say, I'm going to go and use Bitcoin as much as possible. We're going to set up our own voluntary-based currencies, right? We're going to create our own cryptocurrencies, our own blockchains of transparency. We're going to use blockchain technology for voting purposes. We're going to start to interface with each other as communities that are conscious to say we're not, we have enough conscious people, within our own collectives. Even though we're across the planet, we're across the country right now. We have friends who are all over the world. And we can literally start to move towards our own forms of economy and basically say, if you're not a conscious, virtuous being, we don't want to interface with you anymore. That's, I think, the step that has to be taken in the voluntary path of us as beings to choose who we interface with. Ideally, I wouldn't be drinking Starbucks. Trust me. It's like at moments, do I say, look, it's convenience and I'll take it? Yes. Most of the time, I'm going to support the small farmer. Most of the time, I'm going to support the local production chain, right? That's my choice, and that's where we have to empower people to make informed decisions, I think, to ultimately move to weaken the corporations. Because at any moment, those corporations are fragile. That's why they're consolidating. They're gobbling each other up because they are so fragile. But they depend upon us at the end of the day. It's not the government that saves them. It's ultimately the fact that they've hypnotized us into buying their movie tickets, into buying, their products, into buying their bullshit. And if we stop buying it, they will fail.
What about the Green New Deal?
No.
Well, Sean, if
Sorry,
I may,
I'm just trying to add to the conversation, Sean.
I'm really tempted to harp on Sean and make fun
Please
of all
do.
the contradictions
Please
and
do.
Let me hear it.
Please, I'm begging
we want
you.
we want
Please do it.
government
Do
to
it.
get out of the way of businesses, except the infrastructure businesses. Those we want monopolies on. But I'm not going to harp on that point. I'm going to skip ahead.
I didn't say
I'm
monopoly.
gonna
skip
Are you
ahead.
gonna take
By the
that?
way, I never believe in
No,
government.
but that you
Wow.
want government to have.
I
to do
think government should incentivize it because
Okay.
because
So-
someone
You're
has
wrong.
to take
You're
an
wrong.
incentive.
and interfere.
initiative.
All right,
You're
but
wrong.
more importantly, I want to focus on two big things that Caleb brought up that I think are another opportunity for a bridge here that's really important to see. And Sean, I understand that you share this ethical ideal that you're an activist. You're motivated by a sense of injustice that you want
Yes.
and I'm grateful to hear that. Certainly, Caleb is more of that ilk of socialist than the ideologue. And given that, there are a couple important things here that we certainly have in common, as was pointed out, in terms of recognizing the massive economic injustices created by the current system. And where I think, differ slightly in the understanding is how those are inherent with the state. But one place I want to, it just occurred to me as a great bridge of understandings where you say you want a proactive government to go in and right some of these existing economic wrongs, yeah, where there are concentrations. You're nodding, yes? Sort of. I mean, that's one of the things when you say you want a proactive government, that it goes and addresses these unjust concentrations of wealth and power that we know are a product of the Federal Reserve System, that we know are a product of central banking in general, of corporatism, of government favoritism, of all of these things, and in some cases legitimately products of modern industrialization. But most of the concentrations of wealth and power that we see today wouldn't exist without the intellectual property racket, without corporatism, without political corruption. And in the sense that I agree, I would like to see that not untangled. If there was a perfect way to say every dollar that's been stolen shall be returned to its rightful owner, that there would be a way to do that. And I know you're not suggesting anything as silly, as an ideal as that or unrealistic. But there are two things that I think get us in that direction. And one is, as Sean pointed out, the use of Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, just saying, hey, we don't need their monetary system anymore. We already have something. We already have a market-based alternative. We already have a completely voluntary system. And whatever you say about Bitcoin, I don't want to debate it, but in this context, but just to say that look what we just proved is possible here. You don't need a central bank. You can have a system of money that's voluntary, that's not forced on people, and that you have the potential in developing these decentralized systems of essentially, in a Fight Club kind of way, like we're going to take out the debt record. That's what happens. And I'm a techno optimist. I see, especially with cryptocurrency, eventually one way or another, some version of it displacing all fiat currency. And it's a peaceful, orderly transition that it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to, yes, rich people will still be able to take their unjustly acquired gains and buy into cryptocurrency, but it's going to be the hugest step in the right direction that you could possibly have. And did I just say hugest?
Bigly,
thank you. The bigliest
Huge.
Possible that you could have in a way that's voluntary and sustainable. And in terms of government achieving that, this is where I think that the platform politically and of localization would have particular appeal, because we're saying by dissolving the federal government, by localizing it down to the states, that the violent prop of that monetary system of the federal government backing it up completely goes away. And there was one other big bridge, but now we've talked about so much other fun stuff I forgot. But there are a lot of opportunities there. You see where we're going with this, right, Caleb?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of what you're saying here is true. And that if you look at the strength of 21st century socialism, one example could be Nicaragua, right? Nicaragua, under the Sandinista government, has had very big economic achievements, reduced poverty very significantly, increased the GDP by very big amounts. And part of the way they've done that is, even as a socialist government, they have launched a program of helping Nicaraguans to become micro-entrepreneurs. And that has been one of the things that they've been very successful with. And they've been loaning people money and all of that. But their entrepreneurship as small business owners fits in with an overall state central plan to allow economic growth. They don't simply allow corporations to just come in there and do whatever they want. It's capitalism on a small scale, fitting into an overall socialist economic plan of development.
That perfectly. I'm going to throw it right back to you, Caleb. I'm sorry for interrupting, because that gets me exactly to the other point I forgot about. You'll see, I just want to connect with you here and bring this into your point that you need a profusion of wealth, an increase of wealth to have this society that we're envisioning. Isn't it happening regardless, just with the development of technology and the profusion of wealth that comes along with that?
Well, the thing with technology, and I will get to that almost points to why we need to get out of capitalism more than anything. But before I get to that, I must say that, when you talk about localization, if you go around the world to any of these countries that are basically being targeted by Western capitalism, the way they draw their strength, the way these governments draw their strength is from local and community councils, whether it's Venezuela with the Bolivarian circles in every neighborhood, whether it's, in Nicaragua, they've got citizens' power councils. When I was in Iran, I saw the Basij, or the mobilized oppressed, are in every neighborhood enforcing the goals of the Islamic Revolution on a local level. And it seems that these governments that have broken out of the global capitalist imperialist system draw their strength from local communities.
Yeah.
And that is where they draw their strength. But as far as technology, and I like what you're raising about Bitcoin.
Let's go to technology in a second. I just want to, Caleb, I've heard recently really horrible reports, actually, about the Sandinista government, essentially, and the fact that it has become a bully. And just like what we see with a lot of these countries, in Iran in particularly, I mean, I've seen up close how flawed these systems are. And I think that they're not really good models to point at, because you're looking at systems of government that are extremely coercive, more so even than what we have here, which is there's more mental coercion that takes place here, and it's psychological. So I would say Americans funny because in most of these countries, they're corrupt. So it's like, you have a few people of influence and you have to know who to bribe to get out of jail. Or, if you get a ticket, you have to know who to bribe. Here in America, everyone has to bribe. So basically, we all have to pay, $70 if we get hit with a parking meter ticket for 15 minutes over, right? That's the different nature of corruption in America. It's universal corruption.
No, but his point stands because those
confusing.
governments are propped up by centralized system, and his point is not that socialism or that at the central level is the solution, but that the local control makes it harder for those central governments corrupted by larger Western powers or like the World Bank to really harm those communities as much as they would otherwise, right?
I think you're confusing the goal with the method, because socialism is not a goal. Socialism is a tool, and it is something that countries that are deeply impoverished, facing far worse situations than any of us here in the United States face, have utilized to try and get out of dire circumstances. And I mean, the reason, if you look at, the Islamic Republic of Iran, you look at the old Soviet Union, the reason these countries were very authoritarian was out of necessity. They were under straight up attack. They were facing blockades and encirclements. And it's with socialism and with centrally planned economies that they've been able to build infrastructure, eradicate poverty, and do real economic miracles. But that is not the way that they are now. Is not the goal. That is simply the result of breaking out. The goal is to get forward that. And you talk to any person from China, for example, they'll tell you they have big problems with human rights. They need reform. They are the first to admit that they have difficulties and problems. But if you go to countries all throughout the capitalist world that are in chronic poverty, they are kept in that state by the Western system. What makes socialism different is that these countries have broken out of it and that they are starting to move ahead. For example, I always tell people it's really, really ironic. The USA says it supports democracy, right? Well, who are the allies of the United States in the Middle East? You've got the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You've got the monarchy of Kuwait. You've got the monarchy in Jordan. But who are the countries the USA has attacked? The Syrian Arab Republic, right? Yeah. The Republic of Iraq, right? They say, oh, well, in Iraq the elections were rigged, blah, blah, blah. Saudi Arabia doesn't have rigged elections. They don't have elections at all. It's an absolute monarchy, right? Yeah. And the Western capitalist system, the global monopolist bankers that rule the world, they tend to reinforce the primitive and underdevelopment aspects of countries. They tend to keep countries on a lower level, whereas countries that have broken out, whether it's with the Ba'athist Arab socialist model or Bolivarianism like in Latin America or like what China has done, have been able to advance and move ahead. And you can see that. And, in the Middle East, the Saudi government is supporting Wahhabi terrorism all throughout the Middle East. They essentially want to set up, a 14th century government, across the Middle East with public beheadings and women not being allowed to drive cars, et cetera. Whereas, if you look at the forces that are challenging the power of Western capitalism, can they do better in terms of human rights? Absolutely. They would like to do better in terms of human rights. But in order to do that, they have to break out of this system. They have to seize control of the centers of economic power. And that's a necessity. But I think that the ultimate goal of a world without any coercion is a good one. And that's actually, that's the Communist Manifesto, right? The ultimate goal is a vision of a society from each according to their own ability, from each according to their needs. But that is only possible when you break out of the conditions of scarcity. And this whole thing about bitcoins and technology really is the essence. I mean, and it's bizarre that Marxists don't talk about this. If you read Capital by Karl Marx, that he considered his magnum opus, it is all about technology and how workers compete with machines and how in capitalism, the more efficient the means of production, the factories become in producing goods, the more effectively they churn out goods, the poorer people get, right? Because you're reducing the role of people at the assembly line. And that leads to a glut or a crisis, right? Because workers are also consumers. A great example I have here today is Wall Street Journal. Gas glut pressures energy firms, right? So energy firms are losing money, right? The price of natural gas is dropping. If this were to continue, people could lose their jobs. And is this because we don't have enough natural gas? No, it's because there is too much natural gas. Only in capitalism do you have a situation where people are hungry because there is too much food. Only in capitalism do you have a situation where people are homeless because there are too many houses, right? And that's the irrationality of the system, and it shows the need for a state to step in and control the centers of economic power.
Well, no, he's basically pointing at the fundamental issue, right, where it's like supply and demand. So if there's too much supply, then obviously the price will drop. If there's a scarcity, it's most of the time, as we know, it's a created scarcity.
But all those artificial scarcities have been created by governments.
Yes. I mean, my friend in the State Department.
No,
will
I
tell
don't.
you
I wouldn't say it's created by the government. I would say it's created by the fact that the capitalist wants to produce as much stuff as possible, but at as little cost as possible as well. And the capitalist is always looking to increase technology to make production more efficient.
This is where, Caleb, this is where you and I disagree, and I would say it's not the capitalist. Look at Henry Ford's model. Ford had a lot of problems, but he was right. He was against the Federal Reserve System. He was interesting. He was ahead of his time on the electric car, I think, and he wanted to do. He was interested in electric, and I think it was steam powered too. But Ford was a brilliant understanding of capital when he said, "I want my workers to have high wages." Remember, he said, I want to pay my workers well because they're my consumers. And this is actually the businessman's model. And this is not the banker's model.
Hold on,
and this is what we have to get to, is the banking model
I need to get into with
of economics.
A definition here, just to make sure that we're on the same page on something. But first, this thing about scarcity that's really interesting is that scarcity will always be a fact of reality in a finite universe, but
it's an infinite universe.
Oh,
it's an infinite universe, as infinite as your
mind,
all right, as infinite as the resources that we create.
Okay, until we escape the well, I'm getting to that part, Sean. I'm getting there because there will always
take it easy. Take it
easy. In all the multiverses, there will only be one version of this Sean Stone.
Well, maybe
and that's scarcity.
Maybe
right there.
I'm actually
the scarcity of Sean Stone.
Well, no,
should I leave the room?
Never be overcome by the infinite nature of the universe.
But here's the beauty: in the one Sean Stone are all the multiverses.
That's romantic.
All right, yeah. So this is where I think it's important to recognize, and most people looking at these political problems don't acknowledge that in terms of energy, in terms of food, water, clothing, shelter, and even information, entertainment, all these things, we are coming to a point of post-scarcity, and this is where I think that the zeitgeist analysis is really important and powerful. But this idea that without a government interference, that just technology making human beings more capable creates poverty or scarcity is absurd, because it just is. It's all empowering in a way that means the value of an hour of human labor goes up and up and up. And as we get to the point of this quasi post scarcity economy, to me it gives us all the more incentive to say we need to get this ethical thing figured out first, absolutely unequivocally. But the definition thing I want to clear up and then turn it back over to.
And then I got a question too.
I don't care.
After you're done.
Hey,
excuse me. Can I finish?
There are no stupid questions, only stupid people.
I just want to finish.
So,
that's all. I just want to finish.
I'm gonna let you finish.
We'll let him ask.
I'll let you finish.
I'm
gonna let you finish.
I drove all the way down here.
I'm gonna let you finish.
All right, thank you.
I did the driving, Dean. Really?
Ask your question.
All right,
you guys can bicker later. Jesus, we're on a clock here.
I know. Let's.
All right. So, Caleb, the point is that the definition of this term capitalism, because you're definitely using it in a way different than I would. I think when you point to, I think it was one of the first things you said about a shift in the paradigm. I'm really with you there, but it doesn't have to be. I think that this definition would suggest a different type of shift in understanding of material wealth and human happiness and commerce being based on all human interactions and respect for individual rights. And capitalism, I'm not challenging the dictionary definition here. The dictionary definition of capitalism is an ownership system based an economic system based on ownership of the means of production. And when you are misled into thinking that the means of production are tools and factories and that the metrics of production are dollars and widgets, then you really miss the point, and all of the dynamics that are so important in understanding the flow of value in the world from this analysis go out the window. But if you understand that the ultimate means of production is the individual human being, and the only legitimate metric of productivity is human happiness, and you can break that down if you want to into value and go to the next level and say, well, value of goods and services available to an individual human being. But it gives you that ethical framework that says this applies universally. So you say, when you say like reclaim the means of production, if it's a factory that was developed with stolen funds or government privilege and a community says, we don't recognize that ownership, we're repossessing it, I would say that's still capitalism. That's still a recognition of ownership of the means of production, even if it's communal. If a community of people was stolen from to create something, to create a factory, then they are the rightful owners of that product, of that means of production, of that factory. That's not a different system. Under this, what I think is a more comprehensive understanding of capitalism, that's still capitalism.
Well, even socialism is government capitalism in the sense that, look, we know we've evolved our societies to a place where, you know, we don't have to operate basically on barter or on scarcity principles, right? Where it's like, I need to get food for today, so I need to work the land to get food, you know, to have someone give me food for, you know, for in exchange for
That's
work,
how I live.
right? Servitude and
That's how Dean lives.
various forms of feudalism, right? Where I lived, you know, people lived on the lands, they worked the lands, they were fed for it. We understand capitalism's importance in the sense of forward thinking, credit-based systems, or as they've developed into debt slavery. But essentially the idea of, hey, you know, I didn't want to make a movie, and that's going to employ a few hundred people, and it's going to take a few months, and so someone has to make an investment, right? As we know, whether it's an automobile, whether it's whether it's infrastructure, whether it's the government paying for the infrastructure or issuing bonds to pay for a war, or obviously these are the more horrific aspects of where we've seen capitalism go, right? As you say, Caleb, for destructive ends. But there is a notion of capital being invested for future endeavor, right? They cannot simply be produced today for the immediate result of eating today. So in this context, capital has to be issued. Are you saying that ultimately the government should basically be the chief capitalist issuing the funds for these projects, for great projects? Is that how you see it? Because ultimately there is capital, even in socialist systems, right?
The banking system should be controlled by the state. There's no question about it. Lending and credit should be given on the basis of what is good for the community, not for what makes profit for some banker.
What the community asks for, then. What the community requests, and they say, we want this as a community. So
and let me add, by the way, you brought up Henry Ford, and that's very interesting because Henry Ford was an industrial capitalist. He made cars. And if you read Henry Ford's writings, his anger was at finance capital, at bankers, right? As bankers were coming to dominate the economy, Rockefeller and the Morgans and others that were tied in with banking, he was furious because he was an industrial capitalist. And as an industrial capitalist, his worldview was about making wealth through the creation of products. And so while he was vicious to his workers and the effort to unionize Ford was a very bloody one, people died. You read about how Dearborn, what went on there. And I know Bill McKay was a communist organizer. I mean, it was a horrendous struggle to unionize Henry Ford's factories. But regardless, Henry Ford still had a more or less progressive worldview in that he wanted to create things. And he was ranting, and he saw the threat to him as coming from finance. And in that case, it translated into anti-Semitism. A lot of his writings, he blamed the finance capitalists. He went into that whole thing about Jewish bankers, and that was why Henry Ford. But the reason that Henry Ford was oppositional to the overall status quo in the United States is he saw finance as his enemy, and he was earlier. He was in an earlier stage of capitalist development where the factory owners and captains of industry still dominated things. But he lived in a world in the 1930s and 40s that was very much run by bankers. And I think that was the contradiction between him and other wealthy people at the time. I believe he was one of the first billionaires in all of history, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Rockefeller, I think, was the first.
Okay.
Back when he was, I think he was a millionaire in 1900 when a million was like being a billionaire. Remember?
Hold on,
Remember
Sean.
if we took our currency right now, $1 now would buy about a penny in
Hold on,
1913.
Sean,
We have
Sean,
5 minutes.
I'm gonna let Dean finish.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes.
Dean has a question.
Yeah, I do have a question. Thank you for acknowledging my presence in this tiny
No,
room.
hold on, Dean. Dean, I'm gonna let you finish.
Well, God bless you too.
Hold on, Dean.
We got 5 minutes.
All right, we got
Let's-
5
let's
minutes.
go.
I want a question for the socialist. Is
Don't belittle him. Come on,
I forgot his name.
Caleb.
Okay. Yeah, don't call me out on air, Jesus. Christ. Come on. Sean, it's my show. Come on. Anyways, Caleb, sorry.
Dean,
I'm
I
sorry.
can't take you anywhere.
I think it's a dangerous. I think it's a dangerous situation if we're going to force socialism on Americans, especially in the heartland. I think we're going to see a civil war like we've never seen. And honestly, where does the deep state come into play here? I mean, don't you believe Donald Trump's draining the swamp? I mean,
You just made a non sequitur. By the way,
Hey,
can I just point one thing
can
out?
I not ask a
Can I just-
question?
No, I just want to give a little
Well,
response before Caleb does.
first of
Doesn't it
all-
occur to you, by the way, that maybe that the idea, like, if someone says, "Hey, we should have like universal Medicare," like that is not necessarily like a social. I mean, it's being branded
no,
as
it's
a
a s-
socialist tactic.
It's a service, though.
But it's a
I think
service.
it's a
It's not-
service.
It's
Stick to
not,
roast
it's not
comedy.
saying that like you
It's a
can't have
service.
other doctors or other providers of medicine beyond.
That's not
but
what
that there should-
Hills Up
Well-
Paris is
well, let
saying.
me-
Okay, so
Let me jump in here and say I think the reason that there is so much widespread opposition to socialism in many parts of the United States is that people equate socialism with taxation and the redistribution of wealth.
Well, and you can
And
only
that-
shoot your
Well,
way
that's
out of
the
it.
that's the status quo.
That is a
You can
fallacy.
only
That's the
shoot
status
your way
quo,
out of
right.
socialism.
That is-
There's
that's
massive
fallacy
support for the
because-
status
Calm
quo.
down.
Because
calm down.
redistribution of wealth happens under every system to some degree or other. The streets outside of the building I'm in right now were paid for with wealth that was redistributed from me, right?
Right.
That there is redistribution of wealth, taxation, building of government infrastructure, social programs. These things happen under every system to some degree or other. The difference between socialism and capitalism is how production is directed. If the economy is functioning on the basis of chaos of the market, what is profitable for a small group of owners, that's capitalism, right? Socialism is a rationally planned economy. And the goal of socialists is to expand personal property. They want average people to have bigger incomes and have more wealth and more of a comfortable existence. And the way to do that is to have the economy rationally planned and controlled. And I think that's important. Second of all, I would say that you raise the deep state, and that's very important.
Yes,
because
thank you.
These democratic debates,
You're welcome.
beneath the surface, there is a fight in the Democratic Party, I think, between elements that are just average young people who want a better country. And they look at Europe, they say, hey, why can't we have free health care? Why can't we have more of a welfare state? And then I would say some of the most evil forces in the United States, the forces that were behind the Hillary
Biden.
Clinton State Department that have just been a disaster. I mean, if you look, we're still suffering the results of the Hillary Clinton State Department. All these immigrants on the border coming from where? Honduras, where she overthrew an elected leader and cast the whole country into chaos, right? Look at Syria, look at Libya today. I mean, the whole world is suffering because of what the Hillary Clinton State Department, which is really closely tied to, the Council on Foreign Relations and the Ford Foundation, and really these powerful elements that are tied in with the highest levels of finance capital that are probably the most dangerous and evil section of the American status quo. I wasn't happy that Donald Trump won the election, but I was very happy that Hillary Clinton didn't win the election.
Yes.
I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, didn't vote for Trump either, but there is an effort on certain elements, I think, within the Democratic Party to not only beat back the Bernie Sanders and progressive and optimistic wing of their own party, but also to remove Trump because they see him as a barrier to this rule of corporations on an international scale. And I think that's what all of us are up against. The reason the standard of living is declining in the United States is because overall, the United States, like so many other countries, is being, dissolved into this global international financial system where everyone gets poorer and a few billionaire banker monopolists on Wall Street get rich. And
Right.
it's very, very dangerous.
Right.
But let's add, these are the people that created libertarianism, right? Milton Friedman, no one would have ever heard of him if the Rockefellers hadn't funded him. Ayn Rand,
Gary
the
Johnson.
psychopath who glorified
Now we really
rape in
gotta
her
define
novels. All of that
terms.
comes-
Well,
that
we're
was
gonna-
we gotta
brought to you
go.
by the same people.
I'm not gonna let him
We're not
finish.
gonna
Ford
we're not gonna
Foundation.
find we're not gonna
We're not
find
gonna let
peace.
him
They created libertarianism.
Okay.
And anarchism has always been a left-wing socialist current. You can go back to Peter Kropotkin. You can go back to Proudhon. Anarchism has always understood that capital is authority, right? I'm not an anarchist. I don't don't speak for anarchism.
I do.
But the anarchist movement has always been an anti-capitalist movement until recently, until suddenly these creatures from Wall Street suddenly appropriated the term.
Yeah. Look, we're not going to find peace to resolve all our issues today, but I think that we've hit on some really important issues that we can all agree upon, and I think that's the most important point moving forward. Is, as I said, how do we separate ourselves from a system that is morally, ethically, economically bankrupt and actually dead? It's basically a dead thing. Corporation is what? It's a corpse. And we're literally giving energy to the corpse so long as we play along with that game. So let's start thinking about new systems. And got Beavis and Butthead right here in one person. But no, we can literally just
Speak for
on
yourself.
our own, we can start moving in our own directions in communities, be it local, be it national, transnational, because of the internet, because of currencies like cryptos and other things that allow us to transact, and other means of moving forward, technology that will allow us to basically start to disentangle from a dead system. And look, whatever that looks like, it doesn't have to have a brand or a name behind it. I think that's the beauty of it. It's if we're really living in love, it's not about saying, well, I'm not gonna transact with you because you're a socialist or you're an anarchist or you're a Republican or you're a Democrat. Let go of the brands, let go of the labels, be from an authentic space of existing with integrity, finding beings that operate with those same principles of virtue, integrity, ethics, and we can, I think, start to build. We can be the city builders of a much better planet, or at least, of the lives that we want to live. And maybe that's the point. We have to be more in our own space and our own being, and not worrying about what other people are doing so much and telling other people what to do. Because ultimately, I think a lot of times going around telling others what to do just indicates our own lack of self-involvement, of actually refining our own selves and our own issues in our lives. So that's my message for today on Buzzsaw 2020.
Amen.
And I thank you guys, really, really appreciate
Thanks.
everyone coming in here.
Namaste.
Absolutely a pleasure.
Yes.
Danke
pleasure.
schön.
Blessings. Thank you all.